Published in 1869 by Macmillan and Co., the Malay Archipelago is the seminal travelogue and scientific work by British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace. 1823 to 1913. Wallace's 8-year journey. 1854. 1862, across what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, was one of the most important scientific expeditions in history. Before the book was published, Wallace's documentary presence was felt through letters published in the Proceedings of the Zoological Society. This created a textual trail that built anticipation for the Macmillan release. By the time the book arrived in 1869, the scientific community had already been reading his documentary updates for nearly a decade. In the first volume, Wallace provides a narrative that blends high-adventure travel with meticulous scientific observation. The Land of the Orangutan. Detailed accounts of his time in Borneo, where he studied the great apes and collected thousands of beetles. It was during this trip, specifically while suffering from a malarial fever on the island of Ternate, that Wallace independently conceived the theory of natural selection. He sent his ideas to Charles Darwin, leading to their joint paper in 1858. Wallace dedicated the book to Charles Darwin, a testament to their mutual respect, despite being competitors in the discovery of evolution. Natural history of the Indo-Malay Islands. Descriptions of the flora, fauna, and the volcanic geography of the region. Ethnography. Insightful, though dated by Victorian standards. Observations on the indigenous peoples, their languages, and social structures. In this first volume, Wallace provides a narrative that blends high-adventure travel with meticulous scientific observation. The Land of the Orangutan. Detailed accounts of his time in Borneo, where he studied the great apes and collected thousands of beetles. Natural history of the Indo-Malay Islands. Descriptions of the flora, fauna, and the volcanic geography of the region. Ethnography. Insightful, though dated by Victorian standards. Observations on the indigenous peoples, their languages, and social structures. Volume 2. In this Volume 2, Wallace moves deeper into the Australasian side of his famous biological line, the Western Islands, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, to the eastern frontier, the Moluccas, and the edges of New Guinea. Volume 2 contains the narrative of his time on the volcanic island of Ternate. It was here, while shivering with malaria, that he wrote the famous essay on natural selection and mailed it to Charles Darwin, changing science forever. He explores the history and natural beauty of the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, including Batchian, Gilolo, Halmahera, and Sarong. Wallace was one of the first to use comparative philology to support his biological theories. He argued that if two islands shared a large percentage of base words, they must have been connected geographically in the recent past. Throughout his travels, Wallace maintained a standard vocabulary list of approximately 117 common words. For example, fire, water, star, sun, man, woman. He recorded these across 59 different languages and dialects within the archipelago. Wallace observed that the Malay, lingua franca, language, modern Indonesian Malaysian, acted as a thin veneer over the region. Wallace noted its extreme simplicity of grammatical structure and its lack of inflections, which made it the perfect trade language for the diverse islands. He identified significant influences from Sanskrit, religious, legal terms, Arabic philosophical terms, and Portuguese, maritime, domestic items. Just as he found a biological line, he found a linguistic one. Western group, Malayan. Words for fire, API, and water, air, remained remarkably consistent from Sumatra to the Celebes. By mapping these names, he concluded that the inhabitants of the Pacific Islands, Polynesians, were more linguistically linked to the Malays than to the Papuans, despite living much further east. Eastern group, Papuan. As he crossed into the Moluccas and New Guinea, the languages became fragmented. He noted that on a single island like Ceram, villagers living only 10 miles apart could not understand each other's names for basic objects. In the 1,872nd Macmillan editions, this is where Wallace's work shifts from a simple travelogue to a masterpiece of physical geography. In the Macmillan editions, Wallace included several foldable maps that were revolutionary for their time. He used two primary indicators to redraw the map of the world: ocean depth, soundings, and faunal boundaries. Wallace noticed that the sea between Borneo, Java, and Sumatra is incredibly shallow, rarely more than 50 fathoms, 100 meters, the Sunda Shelf. He mapped this as a great Asian continent that had recently been flooded, the Sahul Shelf. Similarly, he mapped New Guinea and the Aru Islands as being physically part of Australia. Between these two shallow banks lies a deep water trench. This is the abyss that prevented animals from crossing, even when sea levels were low during the ice ages. Wallace drew a line where it was named the Wallace Line. This was through the Lombok Strait, the narrow gap between Bali and Lombok. The Wallace Line is only about 20 miles wide. Despite the proximity, the birds on the Bali side are Asian, barbets, weavers, while the birds on the Lombok side are Australian cockatoos, onagators. In Bromo Tengger Semeru National Park, Wallace was also fascinated by the Ring of Fire. He meticulously mapped the active volcanoes of Java and the Moluccas. He observed that Java has a spine of nearly 45 volcanic cones. This intense geological activity was the engine that created the islands, pushing land up from the sea, while other parts subsided. For Wallace, the map allowed him to see into the past. By looking at the depth of the Makassar Strait, he could see the moment when the Celebes broke away from the mainland millions of years ago. He realized that geography plus time equals evolution. We can even tell which islands have been longest separated from the continent by the greater or less novelty of their animal forms. Wallace, Volume 1. In the 1,872 Macmillan editions, Wallace provides a fascinating, if sometimes controversial, critique of how European powers managed these vast territories. He didn't just view politics as a matter of who owns what, but as a biological and social experiment in how different systems affected the progress of the inhabitants. In the mid-19th century, the archipelago was a patchwork of colonial holdings and independent sultanates. Wallace's analysis focuses on three main political actors: the Dutch culture system, Cultuurstelsel. Unlike many of his English contemporaries, Wallace was a vocal admirer of the Dutch administration in Java. The Dutch required villages to set aside a portion of their land for export crops: coffee, sugar, indigo, rather than just subsistence rice. Wallace argued that while compulsory labor sounded harsh to English ears, it had transformed Java into a garden, eliminated famine, and provided a level of peace and security unknown under the previous warring sultans. This political stability allowed Java to support a massive population growth, which Wallace contrasted with the stagnation of other islands. Wallace also spent significant amount of time in Sarawak, Borneo, under the rule of Sir James Brooke. Brooke was an English adventurer who became the Raja of a Malay territory. Politics of protection. Wallace praised Brooke's paternal government, which focused on protecting the Dayak tribes from piracy and headhunting, rather than direct industrial exploitation. This was, to Wallace, the ideal form of political history, a single enlightened ruler civilizing a wild frontier. In the eastern part of the archipelago, specifically Timor, Wallace observed the remnants of the Portuguese Empire. Wallace described Portuguese rule as a state of chronic decay. He noted that they had done little to improve the infrastructure or the lives of the locals compared to the Dutch, leaving the region in a state of political and economic paralysis. Historically, the waters between Borneo and the Philippines were some of the most dangerous in the world. Wallace notes that the politics of steam, the introduction of European steam-powered warships, was finally ending the era of the pirate praus, boats, which had dominated the history of the archipelago for centuries. Wallace believed that while a good government could improve a race's status, the underlying character of the Malay or Papuan people would eventually dictate their political future. In the 1,872 Macmillan editions, Wallace had rejected the idea that the Malays were indigenous to every island they inhabited. Instead, he proposed a central origin theory, the Sumatra-Malacca nexus. He argued that the true Malay originated in the highlands of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. Because the Malay people were expert sailors, they acted as the Westerners of the East, spreading outward and displacing or absorbing the darker, truly indigenous tribes, like the Orang Asli or the Papuans. Wallace classified them as a branch of the Mongoloid family, distinct from the inhabitants of India or Australia, characterized by their olive-brown skin and straight, black hair. Wallace's study of religion in the archipelago is less about theology and more about sociological impact. He observes how names of God and religious law acted as a unifying force for the Malay people. The Islamic veneer. By 1870, Islam was the dominant theophoric force in the Western Islands. Wallace noted that Islam gave the diverse Malay tribes a common legal code and a sense of civilization that separated them from the pagan tribes of the interior island. The headhunters like the Dayaks of Borneo, he observed the shift in naming conventions from Sanskrit-derived names to Arabic ones. For example, Muhammad, Hassan, Abdullah, as a marker of cultural upgrading. Wallace noted that the presence of the Arab was the primary vehicle for the Malayan name and god status through religion. He observed that any person of even partial Arab descent was treated with immense religious reverence, Sheriff or Sayyid. Because of Islam, Wallace found a higher degree of literacy in the Western Islands than in the East. The god of the book necessitated the bookmark, leading to schools in even small Malayan villages where children learned to read the Quran. Wallace was fascinated by the social prestige of the Haji, those who had traveled to Mecca. This pilgrimage connected a remote villager in Celebes to a global religious network. Wallace was struck by the quietism of Malay Islam compared to what he knew of the Middle East. He recorded that while the people called upon Allah, they still made offerings to the spirits of the trees and mountains. Hantu, he remarked that Islam had spread through the archipelago primarily via trade and marriage, rather than the fire and sword seen in other parts of history, which he felt contributed to the gentle, undemonstrative nature of the Malay people. Wallace was one of the first to bring widespread British attention to the ruins of Borobudur and Prambanan in Java. He used grave topographical sites to prove that before the Islamic era, a high Hindu-Buddhist civilization existed. He noted that while the god had changed, many Javanese still practiced theophoric rituals that were secretly Brahmin or Buddhist in origin, masked by Islamic prayer. In the East, Moluccas and Timor, Wallace encountered a transition. He described the animism world of the Papuans as being filled with spirits, Hantu, and ancestor worship rather than a singular high god. The Dutch missionary effect that Wallace observed that Christianity was beginning to take root in places like Minahasa, North Sulawesi, noting that it often led to a rapid adoption of European clothing and names, further complicating the ethnological map. Wallace looked at religion through the lens of a naturalist, noting how God affected the physical health of the population. He strongly attributed the orderly nature of Malay towns to the Islamic prohibition of alcohol. He contrasted this with the drunkenness and brawling he sometimes witnessed in the non-Muslim pagan or Portuguese Christian areas of Timor and the Moluccas. The religious taboo on swine meant that in Muslim areas, the wild pigs he hunted were solely for his own specimens, whereas in the East, pigs were the central focus of village life and social status. Wallace concluded that the Malay origin was inseparable from their religious mobility. Their god traveled with them in their boats, allowing them to establish trade networks that the more stationary Papuan tribes, with their localized spirit gods, could not compete with. In the 1,872 Macmillan editions, Wallace struggled to find a single name for the indigenous belief systems, as they lacked the central text of Islam or Christianity. However, the term he and his contemporaries often use for this eldest religious layer, and the term still used in Indonesia today, is puru-puru, or, more formally, adat paganism. The Dayaks of Borneo believed that the high god spoke through the flight patterns and calls of 7 specific birds, the 7 messengers. Wallace noted that the savage was actually a superior naturalist because their god required them to have a perfect documentary knowledge of every bird's call and behavior. If you didn't know the bird, you couldn't know the law. The birds were the link between the afterlife of the ancestors and the living world. The Dayaks believed the ancestors used the birds to shout warnings from the spirit realm. Wallace noted that a village's topography was chosen based on where these birds were most active and vocal. Wallace, as a collector, faced a moral dilemma. To him, these birds were specimens to be shot and stuffed for the Macmillan text. To his guides, they were messengers of God. He recorded instances where his guides were terrified when he shot an omen bird, fearing the ethical balance of the universe had been broken. In the 1,870 seconds, the status of the orangutan was a subject of intense debate. Wallace was one of the first to document their human-like behaviors. Orangutan nest building. He was fascinated by how they built houses in the trees every night, mirroring the housing habits of the nomadic tribes. Wallace noted that the orangutan occupied a unique ethnological space. It was a creature that looked like a man, but lived in a state of nature that predated all civilization. Wallace ended his study with a dark prediction. He realized that the land of the orangutan was shrinking due to politics trade. He feared that the text he was writing would eventually be the only thing left of the species, as their topographical home was cleared for plantations. Wallace argued that the orangutan's ability to live perfectly in harmony with the topography of the jungle was a form of natural grace. While the civilized man needed text and religion to tell him how to live, the orangutan lived by a divine instinct that required no external law. He used this to challenge the idea that God only cared for humans, suggesting instead that the grand design was visible in the way the orangutan's body was perfectly mapped to the fruit-bearing trees of Borneo in 1855. Sarawak region of Borneo, specifically near the Sadong River. Wallace famously tried to raise a baby orangutan after its mother was killed. This experiment was a direct investigation into soul and God. The observation: he treated the infant like a human child, feeding it with a spoon and giving it a place in his domestic life. He observed that the baby displayed jealousy, joy, and grief. For Wallace, this blurred the line of the divine spark. If a creature has the emotional capacity of a human child, does it possess a soul granted by God? Or is the soul simply a product of biological complexity? Wallace's journals from Sarawak 1855. He recorded, he fed the infant orangutan with a spoon, noting its preference for rice, water, and sugar. The mother substitute: he made a mother out of a piece of buffalo skin for the baby to cling to, observing its intense emotional need for physical contact. The experiment ended tragically. In the late months of 1855, the infant orangutan became ill due to the lack of proper milk, which was unavailable in the jungle. When the baby orangutan died, Wallace did not merely discard it. He treated it with the same documentary precision as his adult specimens. But his writing betrayed a deep sense of loss. He sent the skeleton back to London, where it served as a permanent placement of evidence for comparative anatomy, proving the high cranial capacity of the species. This 1855 experience is why Wallace eventually broke with Darwin regarding the human mind. Wallace believed that if an animal could show such profound soul qualities, then the evolutionary force must be guided by a higher theophoric power. He argued that the soul wasn't just a survival tool, but a gift that appeared in varying degrees across the man of the woods and the man of the city. In the Macmillan 1872 editions, status, legal, social, serves as the bridge between Wallace's biological observations and his socio-political commentary. For Wallace, status in the archipelago was far more fluid than the rigid class systems of Victorian England, yet it was governed by a much stricter code of personal honor. In the 1872 editions, Wallace observes that status is maintained through a combination of adat, customary law, and personal allegiance. The Raja or Sultan, the sovereign status, the source of all names and titles. He holds absolute legal authority, but Wallace notes his power is often checked by the adat. He is the protector of the faith, ensuring that religious law reinforces his social standing. The Pangerans and Datuks, the hereditary aristocracy. These chiefs act as the intermediate legal layer. Their status is topographical. In nature, they control specific lands and river mouths. They are responsible for documentary tax records and providing men for defense. The Orang Kaya, the men of substance, a critical status update. Wallace notes these are often non-hereditary leaders, wealthy traders, or respected elders who have risen through merit. They represent the village status and act as the primary judges in local disputes. The free men, merdeka, traders, artisans, and farmers. Their status is defined by their mobility. Unlike the peasants of Europe, Wallace observed that a free Malay could move his family in allegiance to a different Raja if he felt his ethical rights were being violated. The debt-bonded, Orang Berhutang, Wallace's most detailed status study. He argues this is a legal status, not a racial one. The cause: gambling debts, legal fines, or borrowed capital. The condition: they are slaves of the law rather than property. They live in the master's house, eat the master's food, and can often marry into the master's family. The ethical view: Wallace famously wrote that their soul was often more content than the free poor in London slums, as they were guaranteed protection and sustenance by their status. Wallace also noted a secondary horizontal status for those outside the Malay system: the Haji, a religious status that could elevate a free man above a chief in terms of moral authority. With a chronological status in 1870, Wallace observed that even a low-ranking Dutch or British official often held a legal status superior to a local Raja due to the shift in political history. In the 1872 Macmillan editions, Wallace's observations of Dayak and Borneo women provide a striking counterpoint to his descriptions of the Malay. He uses status and soul, ethical, to argue that these women enjoyed a level of independence and social parity that was virtually unknown in the civilized Victorian world or the Islamic sultanates. Wallace found that the social structure of the Dayaks, the indigenous non-Malay tribes of Borneo, was far more egalitarian than the vertical hierarchy of the Malay coast. Economic agency. Women were the primary managers of the agricultural cycle. Wallace noted they held the status of essential providers, responsible for the planting and harvesting of paddy. Property rights. Unlike the legal systems of the time in Europe, Dayak women often retained rights to their own property and labor. In the event of a separation or divorce, the distribution of goods was handled with a fairness that Wallace found remarkable for a savage people. In the communal living of the Longhouse, women were not secluded, as they often were in the theophoric Muslim households of the coast. They participated in public discussions, and their opinions on village matters were sought and respected. Wallace applied his meticulous ethnological eye to the physical and temperamental status of Borneo women. Physically, he described them as robust and active, possessing a natural grace derived from a life of mountain trekking and river navigation. Comparison to the Malay. He noted that while Malay women were often reserved and timid, Dayak women were frank, confident, and cheerful. They would engage Wallace in conversation without the hesitation seen in the more stratified coastal societies. Wallace used the moral soul of the Dayak family to critique his own society. Despite their lack of civilized clothing by 1872 British standards, Wallace wrote that their ethical status was impeccable. He found them to be extremely modest and noted that infidelity or immorality is almost unknown within the tribal structure. He observed a soul of gentleness in how they raised children. He famously recorded that he never saw a Dayak mother beat or speak harshly to a child, contrasting this with the harsh discipline of the West. Wallace noted that the names and titles for women in Borneo reflected their function. The orang kaya influence. While the head of a village was usually male, the female elders held the unofficial status of keepers of the adat, customary law. They were the documentary memory of the tribe's genealogy and history. Wallace famously described the status of a Malay person as being defined by etiquette. He also analyzed the phenomenon of running amok as a social, legal breakdown. When a person of status lost their face or dignity and had no legal recourse, they would resort to a suicidal burst of violence. To Wallace, this was a dark side of a society that prioritized social status above all else. Wallace observed that the legal status of an individual was governed by adat, unwritten, centuries-old customary laws. Unlike Western law, which punished the person, adat often sought to restore balance to the village. Wallace noted with interest that most crimes, even serious ones, were settled through fines paid in gongs, brass cannons, or cloth, rather than incarceration. Wallace viewed the act of amok as a direct result when a man of a certain social status was pushed to a point where his legal social standing was destroyed and he could no longer live within the adat. He would break the social contract entirely in a final, violent exit. In the tribal societies of Borneo and the Moluccas, status wasn't always inherited. The orang kaya. This was a social title given to men of substance or village heads. An orang kaya acted as both the judge and the representative of the village to colonial powers. Wallace relied heavily on these men for permissions to hunt and collect in their territories. To Wallace, the archipelago was a giant, living clock where different islands represented different hours of evolutionary history. This marks a chronological boundary in human history. Pre-Suez versus post. Suez. Wallace's journey occurred just before the Suez Canal, 1869, made the East easily accessible. He captures the region at the very end of its ancient isolation. He writes with a sense of urgency, realizing that the time of the naturalist was running out as steamships and industrial plantation systems began to overwrite the natural landscape. To explain why the archipelago looked the way it did, Wallace divided the islands into two chronological categories. Category 1. Islands like Bali and Java, which he determined were connected to the Asian mainland in the recent geological past, the Pleistocene. Because the time since separation was short, the animals, tigers, rhinos, remain similar to those in India. Category 2. islands like Sulawesi, Celebes. Wallace was baffled by its unique creatures, the Babirusa pig deer and the Anoa buffalo. He concluded that Celebes had been isolated for a much longer chronological period, making it one of the oldest biological clocks in the world. Wallace viewed the Malays as being further along the chronological scale of civilization, having developed writing, complex government, and world religions. He viewed the Papuans as living in an earlier time, a primitive egalitarian state that he found both admirable and vulnerable to the modern time of European expansion. Coot. We are in a state of transition. The wild man is being pushed out by the time man. Wallace, Volume 2, On of Wallace's Ethnological Studies, focuses on the physical, mental, and moral distinctions between the Malay and the Papuan. Wallace described the Malay, the West, as the perfected maritime race of the East. Physical characteristics of Malay: small stature, olive brown skin, straight black hair, and beardless faces. He noted that the Malay hair is always straight and coarse, while the Papuan hair grows in tufts or mops. He even analyzed the cross-section of the hair, noting the Papuans was more oval than the Malay's circular follicle. Wallace noted the Malays' slightly high cheekbones and oblique eyes, linking them to Asia, whereas the Papuans had prominent brow ridges and a larger, often aquiline or hooked nose. The Malay temperament. This is Wallace's most famous ethnological observation. He described them as undemonstrative, impassive, and incredibly reserved. He noted that a Malay person rarely laughs loudly or shows open anger until the moment of amok. Origin. He classified them as a branch of the Mongoloid family who migrated from the Asian mainland. However, he argued that the Papuan was often more moral and honest in their dealings. He noted that in Papuan villages, he could leave his valuable specimens and tools unguarded, whereas in the more advanced Malay ports, he had to be wary of theft. The Papuan race, the East. As Wallace moved toward New Guinea, he encountered a completely different type. Physical characteristics: taller, darker, sooty brown to black skin, and most notably, frizzy, mop-like hair, which he called tufted. The Papuan temperament, he described them as the polar opposite of the Malay. They were boisterous, impulsive, loud, and highly emotional. He noted that they would scream with laughter or shout in excitement, traits he never saw in a Malay village. Origin. He believed they were the true, indigenous inhabitants of the ancient Austro-Malayan continent. The transition races between the pure Malay and pure Papuan. Wallace identified groups that complicated the map: the Alfaros, a term used for the pagan inland tribes, like those in Seram or Celebes, who didn't fit perfectly into either category. The mixed type. In places like Jalolo Halmahera, Wallace noted a shaggy-haired race that seemed to be a biological bridge between the two extremes. Wallace noted that while the Malays were more civilized, they had almost no native decorative art. In contrast, the savage Papuans decorated everything: their canoes, their houses, and their pipes with intricate carvings. He used this to argue that race was not just about skin color, but about an inner nature or soul that dictated how a people interacted with the world. Wallace found Malay-like people as far east as the Moluccas, but the true Papuan only became dominant once he reached the island of New Guinea and the Aru Islands. He concluded that the Malays were invaders from the west who had pushed the Papuans further and further east over chronological time. In 1870s, for the Victorian reader, the text was the proof. Wallace didn't just tell stories. He provided massive appendices, maps, and lists that acted as a documentary ledger of the archipelago. He didn't just summarize. He provided a table of 117 words across 33 languages. This text allowed other scholars in London to verify his claims about human migration without ever leaving their libraries. In the 1872nd edition, Macmillan included 52 woodcut illustrations. These weren't just pretty pictures, they were visual documents. Wallace's discovery of a new bird of paradise was documented with a high-fidelity engraving to prove its unique plumage. He included drawings of orangutan skulls to document the physiological differences between species, serving as a text for comparative anatomy. Wallace argued that even a tiny variation in a butterfly's wing, if given 10,000 generations, chronological time, would result in a completely new species. This was the natural selection breakthrough he shared with Darwin. While Darwin focused on domestic breeding, pigeons, Wallace focused on the geologic clock of the jungle, Wallace used the primitive societies of the Malay Archipelago as a mirror to critique Victorian Britain. In the final pages of the Malay Archipelago, Volume 2, Wallace presents a shocking conclusion for a Victorian scientist. He observed that in many savage communities, no one was destitute. Unlike London, where thousands died in the streets, every member of a Papuan or Dayak village had a home and food. Lack of crime. He noted that in societies without complex legal status, there was actually less theft and violence because the moral soul of the community was governed by mutual respect and necessity. Wallace argued that as societies become more civilized, technologically advanced, they often become less ethical. He pointed out the hypocrisy of the British Empire, which claimed to bring God to the islands while simultaneously creating massive wealth inequality and industrial poverty at home. He believed the soul of the individual was being crushed by the machine of the 19th century. Wallace also struggled with the ethics of his own work. He often wrote about the guilt of killing beautiful creatures like the bird of paradise just to turn them into documentary specimens. He feared that by bringing these wonders to the name of science, he was also bringing the map of hunters and traders who would eventually drive them to extinction. The intellectual soul, human evolution. This soul versus evolution factor eventually led to Wallace's famous split from Charles Darwin. Darwin believed the human mind evolved, just like a bird's wing. Wallace's view. He argued that the human soul, specifically our ability to understand math, music, and complex ethics, was too advanced to have been created by natural selection alone. He believed there was a spiritual influx that gave humans their ethical capacity. Darwin argued that even the most complex wing pattern could be built over millions of years through tiny, accidental changes. Darwin sent Wallace detailed notes on how many generations it would take for a wing to change shape, trying to pull Wallace away from his spiritualist leanings and back to documentary evidence. In the 1,870 seconds Macmillan editions, the Earth's layers serves as the physical vault of the past. For a 19th century naturalist, the topographical study refers to the geological record, the fossils, rock strata, and volcanic layers buried beneath the surface. To Wallace, the topography of the islands was the tombstone of lost continents. By looking at what was buried or elevated, he could reconstruct the history of the world. Wallace used topographical factors to prove that Borneo, Java, and Sumatra were once part of Asia. The topographical evidence. He noted that the shallow seas, Sunda Shelf, were essentially a flooded plain. Wallace argued that if you were to dig into the earth of Java, you would find the graves of ancient Asian animals, elephants, rhinos, and big cats that are now extinct or rare there, but match those found on the Asian mainland. Wallace viewed the volcanic peaks of the Ring of Fire as the force that pushed new land out of the ocean, the archipelago's spine. He meticulously mapped the line of volcanoes from Sumatra to the Moluccas. He realized that while some lands were sinking into the sea, subsidence, others were being born from volcanic fire. This constant movement created the isolation necessary for new species to evolve. Wallace often used the term uniqueness metaphorically to describe islands as biological time capsules, Sulawesi, Celebes. He called this island a living grave because it held creatures that had died out everywhere else millions of years ago. The babirusa, pig deer, was a fossil that had somehow stayed alive in the isolation of the Celebes topography. The Aru Islands. These were the grave of New Guinea's fauna. Because they were recently separated by shallow water, the fossils and living animals were identical to the mainland of New Guinea. In the 1,870 seconds, grave also referred to the actual burial sites and ruins of ancient civilizations. The Hindu ruins of Java. Wallace visited the grave of empires at Borobudur. He used the topographical layout of these ruins to prove that a massive, organized society had once existed, where now only small villages stood. Conclusion. To Wallace, the grave proved that human status and God were as subject to the laws of change and extinction as the animals. Alfred Russel Wallace passed away on the 7th of November, 1913, at the age of 90. His death marked the end of an era. He was the last of the great Victorians and the final surviving giant of the evolutionary revolution. Despite his massive scientific contribution, he famously declined a burial in Westminster Abbey, where Darwin lies. He preferred a topographical connection to the earth he studied. He was buried in a small cemetery in Broadstone. His is unique. Instead of a traditional headstone, It is marked by a 7-foot-tall fossilized tree trunk from the Portland stone beds, symbolizing his life's work in the placement of geological time. Historically, Wallace's passing saw a political shift in how he was remembered. For several decades, he fell into the shadow of Charles Darwin. It wasn't until the late 20th century that his historical status was restored, and he was recognized not just as Darwin's shadow, but as the father of biogeography. In 1915, 2 years after his death, a medallion for Alfred Russel Wallace was finally placed in Westminster Abbey near Darwin's, bridging the gap between their two legacies.